There's one, okay.
Test.
So I had these questions lined up, but given Dr. Rivera's comments, which I think are very appropriate, I just wanted Tim to maybe give you an opportunity to consider the question that he laid out. So the question was, aren't there times when a particular vision for the common good can merely become a reinforcement of the status quo? How would you respond to that? What are your thoughts on that?
Are you ad-libbing?
I'm trying my best to.
Good work. Good. No, I think Ray was absolutely right, because and I see what he was saying about the book. When the average middle class, upper middle class professional person sees the term human thriving, common good, human flourishing, those are synonyms, they almost immediately think in economic terms. They think of the consumer society they have right now. They want there to be. They just want that to keep on going. So what I think was being said rightly is if you only use that term and you don't go down and say, well, what does that look like biblically? We tend to read into it just the way American society's always been. And the danger with me using the term without calling myself out, in the book and saying, hey, let me just make this very clear, is that people are actually saying, oh yeah, I got that. And they're reading the status quo in. And to be more radically biblical, we ought to be trying to. Now, admittedly, one of the reasons why I don't do that is it's controversial. People would, push back. But I think for us to define human flourishing and define common good is really, really important.
Dr. Rivera, anything?
Yeah, that's what I saw in it. Of course, I start off by saying I'm subjective, right? Anytime someone says they're objective, that raises my hermeneutics of suspicion, right? So I start off by saying that I'm subjective, and it comes out of my own context. But what I read into it was basically that if you define the common good as what we have, then it becomes an obstacle to reimagining new possibilities. You can't reimagine what the kingdom should look like, because in your mind, the U.S. is the kingdom, or Western society is the kingdom. You may not articulate it, but subconsciously, that's your view of the promised land. So it kind of becomes that obstacle that you can't reimagine anything else. So when anything else emerges, you automatically demonize it, you automatically stigmatize it. Great.
So I'm Presbyterian, so that's enough ad-libbing. We'll go back to the script if that's okay. So here's the script. You ready? So what led you each personally to start thinking about the topic of cultural engagement? So it might have been a personal experience or a ministry challenge, or it might have been a book or an author that you read. But what got you on this journey to think so deeply, as both of you obviously have, on this topic of cultural engagement?
Well, for me, it was my conversion. I got converted in a Pentecostal storefront church. After 6 months, I was in Bible Institute. We didn't have Bible colleges, so I graduated 3 years from the Bible Institute. Then my pastor, who happened to be the superintendent, in my 4th year, put me to teach dispensationalism and revelation. I didn't even know the epistles yet, but since there was such a need for teachers, they sent me right out to teach the most profound stuff. Then he sent me to pastor, and it was a 12-member church, and there were 3 families, 12 members, and they were all feuding with each other, So, but it was a secular. I had to work secular in the tent ministry because they couldn't afford the salary, of course. And the first job I got, I'm dating myself, was in President Johnson's War on Poverty. And I got a job as a community organizer. So during the day, I was organizing welfare recipients. And I was telling them, we can change the system now. We can demand a better budget now. But this was the day of where ketchup was considered food. You remember that? And all of that stuff. So I'm dating myself, and I would tell them, we can change the system right now. But at night, since I was a dispensationalist and I believed that the rapture was the answer, In the day I was telling them, let's change now. In the night I was telling my people, we got to wait for the Lord. Only the Lord can change the system. So this produced in me an existential duality. I didn't even know the term back then, but I felt this tension. There must be a way that the gospel responds to both of these things. That the gospel responds to the needs that I'm facing on an everyday basis with my parishioners, and also that the gospel responds to structural change. So the gospel must be able to respond to personal transformation and systemic transformation. And that was my lifelong journey that motivated to seek an answer to that dilemma, the personal versus the structural.
I'll say three things, because everything should have 3 points.
A good Presbyterian, I like it.
Well, no,
right?
I think the first time the first place that I was forced to think about Christianity and how did you phrase it?
So it said when you got started thinking about the topic of cultural engagement.
Yeah. Well, there's a number of places. First of all, I became a Christian. I'm a little younger, but not too much younger than Ray. I became a Christian. The civil rights movement was at its peak, and when I became a Christian, I thought all Christians were for the civil rights movement. I almost went and marched. Not marched, but I might say I came of age as a Christian when there was a lot of during Mississippi burning time and voter registration drives and so on, and all the young evangelicals I knew went off and were part of that. My mother said I had to stay home and get a job in the summer. But so I kind of thought that was what Christians did. When I went to Hopewell, Virginia, I was a northerner from a middle class, went into a southern, very working class and poor town. And that because I immediately saw the cultural difference between me and the people around me, that gave me a second time in which I had to think this out. I'm just being real brief. And then thirdly, when I got here, and I was suddenly surrounded by all these people who came here for their careers, they started asking me questions that I was clearly able to answer. Like, the one I often use is people were saying, I'm an artist, and what does it mean for me to be a Christian artist? Now, that meant every time I had to go to a different toolbox almost. It's like I started looking around and reading, and I would find some books that were more into social justice, books that were more into contextualization, books that were more into, cross-cultural. Because I felt like when I went to Hopewell, Virginia, I was like a cross-cultural missionary. I was a northern young Yankee kid. So every place I got into, that's one of the reasons why I saw what we've been talking about here is that there really is more than one way of doing it. That's the background. I think it's also kind of interesting is if you come up in Pentecostalism that talks about the personal transformation, I mean, this isn't exactly the same thing as the models, but you see, my brother here needed to reach out beyond dispensational Pentecostalism to get some theological resources to work on systemic change. And most of us who come up in a more cognitive, like the Reformed stuff, have to look to a more experiential Christianity to keep ourselves going as the years go by, because we need our hearts to be warmed and we need personal transformation. So I really am not a relativist on this. I really do think you have to inhabit the tradition you feel is true to the Bible, but then you do have to appreciate the other traditions. That's all.
That's great. One more quick question, and I do want to make sure we have plenty of time for the floor, so if there are questions that you want, make sure you have those in mind. But one other question, and I don't know if this is all that provocative, but basically just want to ask you, ad-lib, here we go again. Basically just want to ask you, where do you see any points of difference or different emphases in your two views of cultural engagement, and that provide kind of a good complementary perspective on this very important issue? So do you see points of difference, and how do you see those differences complementing one another or strengthening or correcting one another?
I'll start first. I think we've already actually spoken to this to some degree. I think my brother here has been very, very generous and pointing out, and by the way, Robert gave me your book, and I've looked through it too. And it's not identical, but he was right in pointing out that these various approaches to, depending on where the culture is, the various approaches to ministry are roughly analogous to the things we were talking about. I think my brother's been very generous. I tried to say our social location, we're coming up from different places. So we're moving toward the center from different places. And we're not identical, and we won't strike all the same notes, but I just see a deep appreciation, that's all.
Yeah, I also feel that the book and its position has provoked me to think. I saw all these streams in the church, not as clearly as Tim did, but just existentially and experientially. I kept, connecting with them, and it produced a struggle in me because I was always at tension. In the 3rd chapter of the book, our call to minister in a situation of captivity, it's based on Ezekiel, because all of the book happens in a situation of captivity. So Ezekiel, in his book, it opens up, and he's by the river Kavar, and the heavens open, and he sees visions of God. So he sees a transcended vision. But then he marks the time. He says it happened on in the 5th month, in the 14th day. So the transcended vision came in the midst of a historical context. So there's a creative tension between the transcended vision and the historical context. And that's been my struggle. How do I take the transcended vision, which is the kingdom, which is universalism, but when I was the executive of the Hispanic Council in the Reformed Church, and I was the national staff person, we started gaining power in the church. And we had a black council, and we had an Asian American council, and all of the council started raising issues, shaking up the church. All of a sudden, the conversation changed to multiculturalism. So
you confronted your community.
That's right. So while multiculturalism is the ultimate, the kingdom is for everyone, at the same time, we were on the periphery gaining power. But whenever the balance changes of the people that usually control the discourse under the guise of something else, they raise it, and it weakens those at the periphery. You've heard it many times. They change the rules. Once you master the rules, they change them.
Right. By the way, I have a question. How does the rhetoric of multiculturalism perhaps undermine the marginalized people?
Let me ad-lib. But in my own experience, I think what passes for oneness in the body, or what passes for reconciliation. I was at CCDA last year at a plenary, and their theme was reconciliation, and I was speaking on the theme reconciliation, and everyone was speaking about the brotherly stuff and how great it is. And I raised the question, I said, well, what are we being reconciled to? You're asking me to reconcile, but if what I'm being reconciled to is corrupt to begin with and needs some change, then I have to question what I'm being reconciled to. So just to say specifically, sometimes what happens is the dominant culture or the system of domination will say, yes, multiculturalism, but when you really look at it, it's about dressing up in each other's costumes once a year or eating each other's food. And that's what passes as oneness or multiculturalism. It's easy. Cultural assimilation in the terms of the arts. You can come to my church and we'll teach you how to dance salsa. We'll do that. Or we'll do, that's cult. But how about structural assimilation? See, when you structurally assimilate, that means you're changing the configurations of power. And much of the talk in the institutional church and in the culture is more about what I call cultural assimilation, but not structural assimilation. It's not about changing the configurations of power, and you have to discern that, because I'm the president of LPAC, and at one time I had to resign from about 15 boards because everyone wanted me to be the brown face on their board. because it legitimized their existence because they wanted to be universal, and they needed a brown because they were all what? White. Come on, you can say it, they were all white. So basically, they wanted some diversity. And I was willing to be there, to give a perspective. It was like I enriched it. I was enriched by them too, because I can't be in my nationalistic ghetto, right? But then I found myself, but while I'm building this, I'm not building my own indigenous institution. So it's that tension. You got to balance between the multicultural and between the place where God has you in the body. Maybe he has you in a particular part of the body to build that part of the body, because you want to be multicultural, and when you're multicultural, you get more exposure, and you're a star, and you're the brown star, or the African American star, or the Asian star. Sometimes it's better than be there. It's better to be there than to suffer and organize with your own people.
Great. I don't know what to say. We're just going to move on. This is good stuff. I do have actually a third question, but we're going to keep it with the ad-libbing theme. We're going to move on. If there are questions, how are we supposed to, should we just keep them sitting on their seats? Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to do, if you have questions, if you could raise your hand, there are going to be people with microphones down the hall aisles that will be able to field your questions. So maybe we'll start here and then here, okay? 1 and then 2, and then do you see another hand? And 3. Okay, we'll start there. 1, 2, and then 3.
First of all, thanks. This is a great conversation. I'll make a comment, and then you all can respond. It would seem to me that our view of sin and the continuum of whether we emphasize individual sin versus structural sin influences how we do cultural engagement. And I'll just add one more comment. It seems like there is an overemphasis on one or another, oftentimes, that people talk past one another within the body, but also within our society.
I totally agree with that. That's been my tension as a pastor. I've tried to resolve it because I am Pentecostal and Christ-centered and evangelical. So in my ministry, you'll come and there'll be all-night prayer meetings because we still come out of that Vigilia tradition. So people will be praying and they'll be praying for the sick, and we have seminars on the gifts of the Spirit, and we still do evangelism and have street services. So we are fully committed to personal transformation and bringing people to a knowledge of Christ. But it's also the place where all the organizing happened for Amadou Diallo, for Sean Bell, for Anthony Baez, for police, for when the police does a good job in our community, we celebrate them, we go out to their fairs, we collaborate with them. When we feel there's abuse, we're the first ones out there demonstrating and calling them to accountability. So it's hard to be both, but it's doable. I've tried to do that in my own ministry. Certainly I'm flawed, and probably if you talk to some people, nobody likes me. The ones that are into personal evangelism will say I'm too involved in engaging systemic sin. The ones that are involved in engaging systemic sin, they'll say, why am I spending so much time with our gang intervention programs and ministering to the gangs in the area and trying to bring people in? But I think that's the paradox, that's the creative tension that a holistic gospel requires.
One of the things that I noticed across America in rural areas, but specifically in urban inner city areas, is that there are as many churches as there are liquor stores. And the conditions of our community still are the way they are. So my question is, do you think the church as an institution is failing our communities? And if so, why?
Well, no, I don't think we should say that. For example, I actually recently read an article. Now, I don't live in those communities, obviously, so, and I'm gonna get the guy next to me to say something to this. But you need to know. You have to ask yourself the question: what would those neighborhoods be if all the churches were gone, or half the churches were gone, or 2/3? I'm sure they'd be worse. Somebody recently asked a couple of questions. If you took out, if you took all the Catholic churches out of Chicago, for example, you took all their schools, all their institutions, all that. I mean, now that's not quite the same question, but they added up what an enormous impact that would be, that would have on a particular part of Chicago. So, yeah, obviously the needs are still there. So there's no reason why the church shouldn't be constantly examining itself and repenting on not being what we should be. But I think to really say, because the needs are still there, the church is failing, it's a little too strong. I would say if you took the church out, things would be worse. That's my guess, though.
Yeah, I also think context is so important. For example, I'm a great admirer of Redeemer's ministry because, to me, sin is sin. So basically, in the hood, they steal pocketbooks. Down at Wall Street, they steal whole nations. So basically, sin is sin. So I think the ministry is contextual. I think the Redeemer ministry and the ministry dealing to those that are upward mobile and those that are decision makers in our society, it's just as needed contextually there, and the gospel is transforming people and bringing integrity and ethics to those systems and structures. Tim asks in his book, is the culture good and redeemable, or is it fundamentally fallen? Which is it's a tremendous question. And when I heard that, I said, wow, what do I think? Do I think it's fundamentally fallen, or do I think it's good? And I said, well, again, I'm holistic. I know that I kind of, in my book, I use it that the culture can be an instrument of the demonic, or it can be an instrument of the divine. And we have to discern when it's being demonic, when it's being divine. So I use another language, but certainly I think that the church, as an organism, I like Tim's, and as the remnant, again, as the body of Christ, is an instrument of healing in the community, and it's bringing blessing to the community. It's a catalyst for change. But I also believe that the church institutionally is fallen. See, so I don't know if I didn't read that Tim says that in his book, but I believe that the church as an institution also is part of the fall.
Right.
The church institutionally, and that's why some of the greatest atrocities have been committed in the name of the church. It's also a fallen institution. So sometimes we have to engage the church. We have to confront also the church. So, right. But it's also light, it's also salt, it's also an agent of transformation.
Yeah, let me just finish by saying, having said, I think all those communities would be worse off without the churches. Having said that, there is something that's not in the book. There's another grid I like to use. I love grids. Okay, not grits, grids. Okay, I hate. Also grits. I hate grits. So I'm sorry. Which shows a certain cultural insensitivity. But there's another grid. Doctrinally, churches can be legalistic because they kind of miss the gospel of grace, or they can be too relativist, like we'll let you live any way you want. Or, there's another grid that goes, they're too adapted to their own culture. They never confront the culture at all. And then there's others that are so hostile, so angry toward the culture that they basically have no voice because everybody says they're just crazy. So if you're too hostile, too adapted, if you are too legalistic or too relativistic, you don't have, I think, life-changing power to deal with sin in all its dimensions. And is there any church that hits the bullseye? No, absolutely not. So the point is that the churches aren't what they should be, and that's what we were just saying, that there's institutional sin. The churches are a long way from what they should be, so they're not having the impact on the communities they ought to have. Nevertheless, overall, because God is, the church, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. There really is a lot of great stuff that happens in the communities through the church, and if you took that out, it would be terrible.
I think a third question was in here, wasn't there? No? Oh, yeah.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to meet you both. And my question has to do with one of the problems, Dr. Keller, you were talking about was frustration. And Pastor Rivera, you were also talking about the Jeremiah model. I think there was some kind of a frustrated tone in there. And the reason I'm here today is not necessarily for, even though I have been edified and blessed by the things you've said, I'm here because of my concern for the people that I intend to minister to. And I don't want to name denominations. I have a similar background to you. It's hard to be Hispanic in the city and not have been maybe Pentecostal or whatever. But I deal with a lot of people who are not necessarily toiling in this sinful lifestyle, maybe know the Lord, whose lives have been seemingly permanently altered, and some people's lives have actually been crushed because of a works-driven salvation system. And because it's meritorious and because it's self-saving, a lot of people that I know have been hurt. And because of that, the city, let's say the Hispanic community, has been hurt greatly, especially people who do not yet have a relationship with Christ, because that's what they think the gospel is. So because the city has been affected in this way, and even the Christians themselves have been affected in this way, there are a lot of people to help. My question is, how does all this gear towards helping people who right now can't function, can't form normal relationships with people inside and outside of the church? How can I help people, obviously lift up Christ every way possible, share the gospel, share the full gospel, but how does all this point to the people who are hurt?
Your answerers are struggling a bit because the question is it's a deep and broad question. I think I hear you. I think I hear the question as there are folks that have been maybe somewhat damaged by certain forms of church and Christianity. Again, I'm really I'm enjoying this particular session quite a bit because I think one of the subtext, we haven't quite said this up to now, but it's been behind, but now I'll say it out loud, is that the urban churches, the urban church is more divided in some ways than most, because we have our ethnic differences, we have our language differences. Actually, the church is so big, New York is so big that you have enough churches that they can almost live apart from anybody else. I mean, I remember the first time somebody told me that there were 250, that in the Assemblies of God, there were 250 Spanish language Assembly of God churches just in one part of New York City. I forget what it was. They had their own bishop or something. It just astounded me that that was like a whole denomination. I know a lot of Presbyterian denominations, 250 churches, and the whole country is considered a denomination. Yeah, you have it right. So I actually think that we so many, or Mark Gornick, for example, you know Mark, of course. Mark, who was an expert in African Christianity, at one point told me that he had done his study of, there's 100 or 150 churches planted by Africans in the last so many years, 8 years or something like that. And he told me that at one time, the number one African kind of church leader in the city, not Afro-Caribbean or African-American, African, lived on Roosevelt Island, and I live on Roosevelt Island. That's what Mark said. Neither of us had ever heard of the other. You know, he'd never heard of me, I'd never heard of him. And I think because of that, we can get pretty parochial, and we can become damaged because we actually can. The subtext, which I'm bringing out right now, this is even true of theology, of Presbyterian Reformed theology, for example. It needs to be informed by Pentecostalism, in spite of the fact that it's going to pull back at a certain point. But it's going to point out the legalism that very often Pentecostalism falls into. Reformed Presbyterianism forms in a different kind of legalism. In other words, we'll be very happy to go out and take a drink. But the legalism is a doctrinal legalism. It's just, we're smarter than you. We've worked out our theology better than you. I mean, every one of our traditions has a pathology, a way that we go kind of semi-demonic. And if we are really completely cut off from each other, things can very, very, very bad. Now, you're describing something I'm not firsthand, I can't speak to it, how accurate your report is or to what degree I could affirm it or not. But I know that in general, yes, this is the sort of thing that can happen. And basically, we actually have to build bridges. I really think we have to build bridges between the traditions. It doesn't mean watering things down. It doesn't mean we all are moving towards some kind of ecumenical, vague soup away from our doctrinal commitments. But we really do need to build bridges.
Let me try also to deal with it, because you did mention being Hispanic and being Pentecostal and kind of in the city. And let me just deal with it this way. When I got converted at the age of 15 years old in a Pentecostal church, being on the fringes of gang activity, my pastor in that storefront church was hardcore Pentecostal, regimented structure. I, being a young man born and raised in East Harlem, that my psyche had been damaged by a system that portrayed me and my people basically as welfare cheats and the corner beer drinking crowd. I had internalized that negative self-image of myself. So when I went into that Pentecostal church storefront, it wasn't only a spiritual experience, it was also the beginning of a counter-socialization process. What the dominant culture has said about me and my people in that church was totally contradicted. Why? Beside the Christ-centered experience that was the most important, all the leaders were Puerto Rican. So it showed me indigenous leadership. The Spanish language that was belittled by the dominant culture, there was a source of pride. So I started praying at the altar, Lord, teach me Spanish, because I couldn't communicate in any other way. So the first bilingual program in this city was not the Board of Education, it was the Hispanic Church. So what else happened? Role models. All of a sudden, all the deacons were what? Puerto Rican. All the elders were what? Puerto Rican. All the preachers were Puerto Rican. So what the negative self-image that the dominant culture perpetuated in that local small storefront Pentecostal church was totally challenged, and I was re-socialized, and I began to see my people as articulate leaders. And that same thing happens in the African American experience. When you go into an indigenous setting, the dominant culture which stereotypes your people, the church becomes a re-socialization process. Now, the legalism, let me address the legalism. I was a young man that dropped out of high school, and I used to get up to go to work at 11:30 in the morning. So that means I really didn't want to work, right? Because you can't get a job waking up at 11:30 in the morning. So I lacked what? Discipline. The Pentecostal, that first generation Pentecostal structure was regimented. So what did it give me? Discipline. They told me you can't smoke, you can't dance, you can't go to movies. And when you go to church, you got to wear a shirt and a what? Tie. And a tie. So what it gave me was had nothing to do with the gospel, because you don't need a tie to get saved. Amen?
Amen. Amen.
But it did give me discipline and regimentation. What happened though? As I grew in the Lord, the same thing that gave me structure started to suffocate me, because you go through a process. So what I'm saying is, when you really are reflective of indigenous religion, you got to reflect comprehensively. I have a lot of young Latinos from the new generation that are critical of the old church. You know what I tell them? When you build a church and when you build a movement like our indigenous leadership has built, then you have the right to critique it. Now, I'm not telling you to stay. If you're too suffocated in there, I couldn't stay. I left in the 70s. That's why I became Reformed, because my theology didn't fit in that indigenous Pentecostal church. But I've always considered myself experientially Pentecostal. I've always respected and lifted up all of our role models, because you can't be whole if you deny your past.
So we got like a couple minutes, and so I'm going to take the right of the last question, if that's okay, but let's keep it really brief. I don't know if you can. I'm opening up a different can of worms, but at least try to best to be brief. One whole field that we need to think about when it comes to cultural engagement is the question of our lay people's vocation. So the work that the people in our congregations do from Monday through Friday. What role do you see, again, really quickly, as far as the role of our lay people in the church scattered, not just church gathered? If you had to do a nutshell response to that, what role do our lay people have in their vocation as far as contributing to the conversation around cultural engagement?
I heard Rivera once preach on Esther, and he was talking about the fact that Esther was in the palace, but she was willing to not just blend in the end, but identify with her people and speak up for justice and risk losing the palace, but God was willing to keep her there. Remember that sermon? Yes. And it's a great model. It's basically saying that if you get out of the hood and you find yourself in the professions with a lot more cultural power and all that, the danger is to sell out. And to understand human flourishing is just having a nice salary and living in a nice part of town and just living in the nice parts of the world and forgetting about the other parts of the world. So what I liked about that model was that Esther is a model in that she made it up into the palace. But she spoke. She knew she was risking things. She knew she might get. She might. In her case, of course, it might get killed. In our case, it would mean losing prestige or maybe not. But to speak up for justice and to think about the people who are not in the palace, but to use your cultural influence in that way, is a very good model. Now, the trouble is, it was his sermon, so if he was going to use that, I just took his answer away from him.
I also believe in the priesthood of all believers, and certainly empowering the laity and ending as much as possible the division between clergy and laity. I don't think a pastor like Pastor Keller could not have had the impact that he's had here and in the other 200 cities without empowering the laity. So I basically think that to empower the laity is the way to go. In my own tradition, the Pentecostal tradition, that was also a positive thing, because we started preaching when we were 13 and 14 years old. They would put us to preach in front of the church. We didn't know what we were saying, but they would put us to preach, and they would activate us, and they would give us opportunities to preach and direct, so I do believe that the mission of the church can't be done from the pulpit. You have to empower the whole laity through the gifts.
Okay, thanks. Can we give these two men a round of applause?